My name is Will, and this is the second video in a series about the DC Comics character Martian Manhunter. This will primarily cover the character's appearance in Detective Comics from issues 273 to issue 326, which corresponds to a time from 1959 to 1964. But there will be a little overlap with the time covered by the previous video. During these 5 years, you have an explosion of superhero characters. Hal Jordan, Green Lantern, the Atom, Spider-Man, Hulk, Thor, Ant-Man, the Justice League, the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, the X-Men, all start in these 5 years. Now, J'onn J'onzz had been slowly going from being a detective towards being more of a superhero. In Detective Comics 273, he takes a big step in this direction by suddenly having a public superhero identity. In this story, the Martian villain Barrett comes to Earth to conquer it. Now, Barrett is no master villain. He robs a bank and then realizes he doesn't really need money. He has a powerful gun and empties a charge, shooting at an invisible J'onn J'onzz before thinking to use a drug that prevents J'onn from using his powers while invisible. Now, this drug is a way to transform the character. In his detective era, nobody knew there was a Martian on Earth because J'onn would either be masquerading as a human or be invisible all the time. He had no public identity, and very few people ever saw him in his Martian form. Those that did were often criminals and were thought to be lying about a Martian existing. This drug, the Z6 formula, forces J'onn out from his hidden existence. In the story, the drug is intended to be applied to criminals to keep them from using their power while invisible. And it means J'onn can't use his powers while invisible anymore, so he's forced to reveal himself in order to stop Barrett. The police see him, and they think they have to fight 2 aliens, but J'onn assures them that he is good. And this is the Silver Age, so the cops are like, yes, we got a Martian on our side. There's no government distrust of heroes or aliens in the Silver Age, partially because the massive level of censorship prevented any negative depiction of authority. So now J'onn has a public superhero identity as Martian Manhunter, although initially he is referred to as a Martian Manhunter. Does J'onn give up his secret identity? No. And to be honest, no real reason is given, but the secret identity thing is a superhero convention, so he goes with it. Okay, let me talk a little bit more about Barrett. He is yellow. Why is he yellow? I'm not sure. It is not called out in the comic, and I suspect it was just to make him visually distinct from J'onn. He also has different colored clothes, wearing maroon where J'onn wears blue, and blue where J'onn wears red, which increases the visual distinction. He has a kind of reverse Flash vibe going, for those of you who know about the Flash. Some have suggested that Barrett is a special kind of yellow Martian that also shows up in Wonder Woman comics, where the Martians are yellow, but I am pretty sure that is just fans inferring a lot of world building that just isn't there. I think we need to understand that the creators figured that Martians come in lots of different colors, like humans do. And in Edgar Rice Burroughs' books, there were lots of different colored Martians. Do we think Jack Miller or Joe Certa was trying to make a subtle point about race? Not at all. Anyway, so let me take a step back and talk about race, gender, and sexuality for a bit. The comics in the 50s and 60s are not vehicles for racism or sexism, but they do reflect a highly divided society. The only time you see a non-white character is when J'onn travels to Africa to save some Africans from white criminals by impersonating a witch doctor. Anyway, you also see a lot more men than women, although you do get a female character who's a police officer, Diane Mead. Where Diane fits in terms of representation of women is complex. She's a police officer, but she's also a nepotism hire because she's the police commissioner's daughter. She's brave and confident, but this mainly is a trait that gets her into trouble so J'onn can save her. Anyway, the nature of the evolution of feminism is complex and not the topic of this video. But let's talk more about this new character, Diane. First, she technically isn't new. Diane was a character who showed up in Detective Comics 246 during J'onn's secret detective years. Once J'onn became a public superhero, he starts to get more of the trappings of a superhero, one of which is a love interest type character. Diane is J'onn's Lois Lane, or Wonder Woman's Steve Trevor, Aquaman's Mira, or Batman's... Bruce has been with a lot of women. So Diane returns to the comic over 2 years after her first appearance, and she becomes J'onn's partner. She shows up in about half the stories. She is both a damsel in distress and a romantic interest, but also a person he has to hide his identity from. One of my favorite Diane Mead moments comes in her first appearance during his superhero years in Detective Comics 275. She immediately figures out that he is the Martian Manhunter when his human form disappears, immediately followed by his Martian form showing up. It seems to me this is a play on the Lois Lane Superman dynamic where he constantly disappears and she doesn't figure out that Clark is Superman. Anyway, Diane is incredibly supportive and promises to tell no one. Instead of being honest with her and welcoming someone knowing his lonely secret, he decides he must deceive her in order to protect her. The rest of the issue is John figuring out a complex plan in order to trick her. So her figuring out his identity and him basically tricking her into thinking she was wrong is a classic Silver Age superhero bit and happens a few times. Okay, let's talk about the romance aspect. What does she feel? What does he feel? What actually happens? Well, this isn't a romance comic. It doesn't have a lot of room for developing relationships, so not a huge amount happens. Now, Diane is clearly taken with John, his human guise, and repeatedly tries to get his attention. Note that Diane doesn't have any romantic feelings for the superhero Martian Manhunter, somewhat breaking the Silver Age mold. For John's part, he does seem to have some interest in Diane and states that he enjoys having her around. In one issue, he does ask her out, but again, this romance isn't much of a focus. And this pattern, where the female is the one who expresses interest more than the male, is a common Silver Age pattern. The whole romance angle more serves as a way to have Diane get into trouble while trying to impress John or attract his attention. She then serves as a damsel in distress. Now, Diane isn't a kind of delicate flower. She is both brave and confident, but her bravery often gets her into situations where she needs John to help her. He often does this secretly as to preserve her ego. For example, in Detective Comics 290, Diane becomes a stunt woman in a movie that is being sabotaged. She performs incredibly dangerous stunts that are also sabotaged and would normally kill her, but John is able to secretly help her by doing things like creating winds to prevent her from falling or shielding her from explosives that would have killed her. One time she goes after flying criminals in a helicopter, but she gets snatched out of the copter and taken prisoner. Another time she tracks down a missing scientist, but ends up getting taken prisoner by aliens that John has to deal with. So Diane is competent, but also no stranger to getting into trouble. She isn't the only character to join the cast. In Detective Comics 311, John encounters some aliens from another dimension. He also encounters a creature being attacked by a mob of humans, and John saves this creature. When John asks one of the aliens about what it is, he's informed it is an animal from their dimension called a Zook. When John sends the aliens back to their own dimension, this Zook gets left behind and becomes John's pet, which he names Zook, like naming your dog. But this pet phase doesn't last long because John teaches him to speak in the next issue, and he becomes more of a kid sidekick. Sadly for Zook, he doesn't get included in the Teen Titans, and eventually Miss Martian gets kind of weirdly designated as John's sidekick. More on that in a later video. So Zook was certainly powerful enough to be in the Teen Titans. Despite being drawn to be like a super cute alien puppy, he has an impressive array of abilities, much like the Martian Manhunter himself. Zook could alter his temperature to be extremely hot or cold, making him able to set fires, melt stone, freeze people, and put out fires. Note that when your big weakness is fire, having a sidekick that can put out fires can be handy. Zook could also reshape his body to a limited extent. He could become flat and fit through a mail slot, for example. He could also sense people with his antenna. If he encountered someone, he could then unerringly track that person, which is a pretty good skill when hunting criminals. This also allowed him to see through disguises. For example, an alien impersonating John Jones couldn't fool Zook, and if John was impersonating someone, Zook would know. Actually, Zook would make a great villain because he can track John no matter what, see through any disguise, and create fires. Yeah, the Return of Zook arc basically writes itself. Anyway, John becomes Zook's teacher and companion. He states that he loves Zook, something Diane never got, and Zook helps him out and serves as a sidekick. Zook is also friends with Captain Harding and Diane Mead, and they know he is the Martian Manhunter's sidekick. But don't worry, Zook is good about keeping John's secret identity secret. So once Zook is in the picture, John needs a place to keep Zook, presumably because his apartment has a no alien pets rule. So John gets the classic superhero headquarters, his version of the Batcave or the Fortress of Solitude, and it is very secure because It is an open area inside a mountain that has no entrance beyond a mail slot. John can become intangible and move through solid matter, and Zook can adjust his body to slip through a mail slot so their base can't be entered by humans. Kind of makes the Batcave security look like crap. As to how John and Zook got the equipment and furnishings into their base, well, let's not dig too deep. But one time, John loses the ability to become intangible, and he actually essentially gets locked out of his own base. So all that security has a few drawbacks. Alongside a sidekick, romantic interest, and secret headquarters, John also gets a transformation panel. The new story standard is that he encounters something in his human guise and then transforms to be in his Martian form. So this transformation from secret identity to hero gets emphasized by a special panel starting in Detective Comics 283. This panel shows both his human and Martian forms overlaid on each other with a background of multicolored concentric circles. I think that Joe Certa probably wanted to expense his mechanical compass. If you don't know what a mechanical compass is, I envy your youth. This transformation panel evolves over time. It starts with just the headshot, but then becomes a whole body shot. In many of the panels, there is a lot more Martian than human, so eventually Certa puts the transformation at an angle to best show both John's human and Martian form. Note that this transformation does get retired when John retires his detective secret identity. In terms of art, I also wanted to mention how Joe Certa's depiction of Martian Manhunter slowly changes over the years. In the first issue, he has a noticeably large brow. Over time, this slowly goes away, and by the time he reaches his hero phase, it is gone, and he is depicted simply as a green-skinned bald man. The depiction of his powers had also been evolving, but by this time, John's basic powers are kind of settled down, and they very much fit into a superhero mold, specifically a Superman mold. John is super strong, super fast, super tough, can fly, and has super breath that can push or pull objects as large as a truck. He has super hearing and super sight, including both microscopic and X-ray vision. So he feels very much like a green version of Superman, with Diane Mead being a police officer version of Lois Lane. Now, at this time, Superman was the most popular superhero around and headlined numerous comics, so it isn't shocking that John would end up being more and more like Superman. They even steal the whole "this is a job for" line. Now, being too similar to Superman would come back to haunt the character in the future, but I will talk about that more when I talk about the Justice League. So one thing that John starts doing when he switches over to being like Superman is he uses his powers in tricky ways. A classic one is combining speed, invulnerability, flight, and presumably some form of immunity to dizziness to turn into a living drill and drilling through the earth. He can snap his fingers to create some kind of directed sonic blast. He can flick small objects to knock bullets out of the air. He can create waves that can carry boats high into the air. He can destroy things or knock people out by rapidly tapping objects or to create vibrations. The powers get a little crazy sometimes, like when he runs on a helicopter's blades in order to slow it down and force it to land, or when he uses his hands to create incredibly precise air currents that cause a set of light bulbs to orbit his enemy. It was the Silver Age. Anyway, beyond his Superman-like set of powers, he had his intangibility, which is how he entered his base, and his invisibility. But since he loses his powers when invisible now, he uses it somewhat sparingly compared to the days when he was invisible all the time. And even though he doesn't pull new powers out all the time, he does occasionally demonstrate some random ability, like being able to turn into a giant or being able to possess a tree. I guess you could say this is him using shape-changing and intangibility, but they kind of feel like powers he just pulls out of nowhere. Okay, I haven't mentioned the shape-changing yet. He can also change his shape, which is kind of integral to the character since he is a green-skinned Martian masquerading as a human. But this power evolves over time. Because he embraces the whole dual identity thing, he often shows up as a human and being John Jones. But when he performs heroics, he switches to his Martian form. Now, originally he had all his powers in both forms, but during this period of being a public hero, he stops using his powers in human form, since he always switches to his Martian form before doing superhero stuff. So this introduces a subtle change. In issue 306, he encounters a meteor that begins to weaken him from afar because it somehow has a fire nature. But when he changes back to his human form, he's no longer vulnerable to these fire rays. So when in his human form, he's no longer weakened by fire. In issue 314, it is explicitly stated that he doesn't have his powers when in human form, and he is badly injured by a weapon that later has no effect on him in his Martian form. In 315, he transforms into a Neptunian waterman and a plutonium birdman, and he has the powers of those aliens and doesn't have the weakness to fire. Wait, doesn't that mean he can change into a Kryptonian and have all the powers of Superman? Don't worry, I will address this. Okay, so from this point on, Martian Manhunter has the powers and weaknesses of any form he takes. That means that when he's in his human form of John Jones, he's vulnerable to injury like any human, but he doesn't get weakened by fire. Of course, he's already weakened by being a puny human. Over the course of his adventures, he uses his power occasionally and collects some interesting forms that include fire-breathing monsters and a monster that can travel between dimensions, but he almost never uses the power to change into a useful form from the past. For example, in his own book, he never changes into Superman. Changing into the Waterman and the Birdman is kind of a one-off thing. But when he encounters a monster with a special ability, he will often change into it. He even changes into monsters that he only sees pictures of. Okay, so Superman. When does he change into Superman, and why doesn't he do this constantly? Okay, Jack Miller wrote comics when it wasn't a particularly prestigious job. He actually was more interested in writing plays, and writing comics was probably more to pay the bills. So he was just thinking about putting out stories and not about all the things that John could turn into. Along comes another guy, E. Nelson Bridwell. Bridwell was an actual comic fan and he liked continuity. Basically, a giant nerd. Here's how I imagine the conversation between the two of them going. Superman is awesome! No one can beat Superman! Who let this kid in here? Hey, you write Martian Manhunter. He's strong, but Superman is stronger. Do you work here? Are you someone's nephew? Admit that Superman is the best! Screw you, kid. Martian Manhunter could just turn into Superman and have all the same powers. Or if Kryptonite was around, he could change into something else. It's Kryptonite! And no! So, Bridwell gets to write Flash 175, where they have one of those races between Superman and Flash. The race is forced on them by a disguised Reverse Flash and Abracadabra, and while Flash and Superman are racing around space, Superman suddenly attacks the pair of criminals. They whip out a piece of gold kryptonite that permanently strips Superman of his powers. But it turns out that Superman is really the Martian Manhunter, who turned into Superman to escape a fire cage. But being exposed to gold kryptonite while being Superman makes it so John can never turn into Superman again. John then uses his Martian science to turn the gold kryptonite to lead, thus protecting Superman later. All this is about a page and a half in the comic and has nothing to do with the rest of the story. You could cut this out and no one could tell that anything had been removed. Bridwell just put this in to make it so John couldn't turn into Superman. After he does this, he even uses the line, "With that side play out of the way." Anyway, it's little things like this that make me happy, so I thought I would share. Okay, there's one last little bit of superhero-ness I should mention. Superheroes typically had catchphrases or exclamations. Martian Manhunter during the Silver Age had a collection of fairly boring exclamations, mostly relating to spacey things. For example, "Great cosmic clouds," "Great Jupiter," or "Great rings of Saturn." The nature of these exclamations would eventually change and take on a very different tone many years later, but that's a topic for a future video. Okay, now let's talk about the stories. Many aspects have changed. You now have more of a cast with Diane and Zook. People know about the Martian Manhunter and they ask him for help. He has friends in Martian form, like his friend Larry, who needs help with swindlers. Or in his human form, he's his friend Ted, who needs help with a movie. Now, these people aren't recurring characters, but they are said to be his friends, and doing favors for friends was a common story pattern in the Silver Age. The stories do start embracing more of the Silver Age feel. They get a little wilder. Standard Silver Age stories come into play, like time travel. Note that this time travel wasn't to change the future or past or anything. They just wanted to have John and have a couple adventures in ancient Greece or during medieval times. Being shrunk was another Silver Age standby, as was amnesia. Diane, Zook, and John all get amnesia at some point, and John also faced getting amnesia at one point. I will pick a couple particularly odd stories as good Silver Age examples. In one issue, John gets amnesia from being struck by lightning. He forgets he is an alien. He strangely buys an old-style lamp and starts thinking that his powers come from the lamp. In an even weirder story in Detective Comics 281, he builds an enclosed park that replicates the Martian environment. That's not really that weird. NASA has something like that called Mars Dune Alpha to simulate Mars. What's weird is that when humans enter the park, they gain Martian powers while John loses his powers. Maybe that's why certain people are so gung-ho about colonizing Mars. Anyway, in this park, you inevitably get criminals with superpowers. But luckily, humans in this Martian environment are vulnerable to flames, while John isn't, so he's able to easily defeat them. The stories also get longer. Increasing popularity of the character, probably due in part to him being in the Justice League, gets him more pages. In issue 301, the stories go to 12 pages, basically doubling the story size. And you get a new type of story, one centered around hiding his weakness to fire. Because it is so easy to disable the Martian Manhunter with fire, he has to make sure the criminals don't find out about his weakness. And when they do find out, he needs some way to trick them into thinking they were wrong about his weakness. For example, the human flame thinks he has figured out John's weakness, but John is able to beat him despite this, and the human flame then thinks he was mistaken. Another time, criminals witness flames weaken him, but John tricks them by having a guy disguised as him confront them while he battles them from hiding. A Martian Manhunter museum that details his exploits accidentally reveals his weakness, and criminals attempt to use it against him. John borrows an animatronic from the museum to trick them into thinking they are mistaken. These kind of stories where the villains figure out his weakness were typical for the Silver Age, which was famous for a certain style which I tend to anachronistically think of as clickbait. The cover of the comic, or the first page, would typically have a scene from the middle of the comic to give a preview of what was going to happen. So one of the things they did was to have something very extreme or strange on the cover to get people to read it. For example, Martian Manhunter might have his weakness discovered, or be committing a crime, or Diane might suddenly have superpowers. So you would have to read the comic to figure out what was going on. If this idea is strange to, or new to you, this must be the only time you have ever interacted with YouTube. Note that this also is driven by the consumption patterns, where a consumer would be purchasing individual comics as opposed to buying comics in a subscription. So each comic had to hook the reader. Anyway, this style was heavily used in the Silver Age by editors like Mort Weitzinger and Julius Schwartz, who would often have the cover created first and then have the story filled in to explain it. Now, Martian Manhunter wasn't on the cover and never gets as crazy as some Superman covers get, but the style does get used and does lend itself to a certain kind of story. These stories typically involve the hero doing some sort of trick or con job. For example, John might pretend to have amnesia so he could get recruited by criminals. He might perpetrate a hoax where aliens defeat him so criminals come out and ally with these fake aliens. He might trick Diane into thinking she has superpowers in order to convince criminals not to mess with her. Okay, in the last video I talked about villains and about Mars, but another element that frequently shows up is aliens, and I mean non-Martian aliens. As I mentioned in the last video, there was a lot of interest in space, so as John goes from detective to superhero, he starts encountering aliens. Now, there isn't much world building here, and no alien race shows up more than once. But John encounters aliens from Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, Mercury, and another planet called Centauria. He also encounters aliens from another dimension. What I think is really interesting is that in almost every case the alien society is lawful and non-aggressive, and the people that John are facing are criminals. He assists aliens from Jupiter and Saturn in hunting down their criminals. The aliens from Mercury and Pluto are also noted as being criminals or renegades. There is one case where he does encounter an alien race that wants to attack Earth, but he manages to convince them not to by tricking them into thinking Earthlings are incredibly powerful. These aliens are from Centauria, so this story breaks the mold in both having aggressive aliens and having a made-up planet outside of our solar system. Now, the aliens John encounters are often very powerful and are usually a potential threat to John, but none of them really top Martians in terms of power. So when he encounters aliens, one issue comes up. Why don't the aliens take him home? Well, the aliens from Jupiter offer to take him home, but he can't go back with them because he has to defuse a bomb.
Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
So, one pivotal story relating to his being stuck on Earth during this period is in Detective Comics 301, and is the first of the longer 12-page stories. A scientist repairs Urdel's robot mind, allowing instantaneous transportation between Earth and Mars. That scientist then goes to Mars to acquire a following, and he tries to conquer Mars using matches and a torch. That's right, Earth invades Mars. We started it. The scientist, Dr. Alvin Reeves, sends his Martian allies to attack Earth in order to obtain superweapons, aka matches. Yes, Martians have spaceships and weapons that can liquefy stone, but they are not able to make fire. So, John returns to his home, and we get a look at Mars, which seems an awful lot like an airport at first. But you do get some wildlife, like giant yellow butterflies. But John gets to see his parents and his brother in person. Then he goes and saves his people from both the scientists and his Martian minions, with John's secret knowledge that wet matches won't light. But after this point, John is able to return to Mars using Urdel's machine, but he decides to stay on Earth. He doesn't really get too deep into why he makes this decision, but after this point in the comic, staying on Earth is John's choice. Now this actually clears up a fairly big inconsistency. John is part of the Justice League. He is friends with Superman and Green Lantern, both of whom could probably return him home. Also, the Justice League has adventures in space, like in issue 3 where they fly around in Kanjaro's spaceboat. Presumably John could get dropped off at Mars. So him being able to go home, but choosing to stay on Earth, makes his own stories consistent with the Justice League. But Jack Miller never has John use Urdel's machine again to return home. This is actually the last story Miller writes that involves Mars, although he does pull in another Martian criminal. Strangely, Bob Haney, who writes Brave and the Bold, has the Martian Manhunter use a robot mind in both of the 2 stories he writes for him. At this point, Brave and the Bold had become a team-up book, and John has a team-up with Green Arrow, and he has a team-up with Flash. And in these team-ups, he travels to other planets, including a visit to his home world, to learn about some Martian criminals that he and Green Arrow must face. One interesting note is that Haney does not use the Martian naming convention, and his Martian criminal is named Volcor, while the criminal Miller adds is named Ben Burns, keeping with the naming convention. In terms of conventions, I wanted to mention the notion of place. Where do his adventures happen? The comics are written in a placeless way. Instead of actually naming locations, the location is vague. And when locations are named, they have generic names. Now, during this period, they do occasionally mention Middletown a couple times, but it's meant to be a generic name for a place that really isn't anywhere and isn't fleshed out in any way. There's a lot more to John's story and a lot more to say about him. In the next video, I'll talk about John as a part of the Justice League of America. If you like this content, please like and subscribe, and constructive comments are also welcome. It will encourage me to make more videos.